Dr. Kenneth Parker, a brilliant cardiac surgeon, boards a flight that quickly turns into a moment of unexpected confrontation. After facing racial discrimination from the airline staff, his expertise is urgently needed when a life-threatening emergency occurs mid-flight. What begins as humiliation becomes a turning point, leading Kenneth to stand up for justice in a battle that could change the system for good. Curious about how Kenneth's journey unfolds? Like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories. What would you do in his situation? Share your thoughts below. Dr. Kenneth Parker leaned back in his seat, gazing out the small oval window of the plane as the last of the passengers filed into their seats. Flight AA-1024 was preparing for its cross-country journey from New York to Los Angeles, and Kenneth was one of the lucky few seated in first class. But for him, it wasn't just luck. It was a seat he had earned, a symbol of the hard work and success that had defined his career. At 45 years old, Kenneth was at the pinnacle of his profession. A cardiac surgeon from Atlanta, Georgia, he had spent the last 20 years building a reputation as one of the most skilled and innovative surgeons in the country. His research on minimally invasive heart surgery earned him international recognition, and today he was on his way to present his latest findings at a prestigious medical conference in Los Angeles. As he settled into his seat, Kenneth allowed himself a rare moment of relaxation. The pressures of his career, the endless hours in the operating room, and the weight of expectations he carried as one of the few black surgeons in his field. None of it seemed to matter at that moment. Here on this plane, he was just another passenger, enjoying the luxury and comfort of the first class. He glanced down at his boarding pass, still tucked into the pocket of his neatly pressed blazer. Seat 2A. The flight attendant had already come by to offer him a pre-flight beverage, and Kenneth had accepted a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. As he sipped the drink, he couldn't help but think of his family back home. His wife, Sophia, and their two daughters, Hannah and Chloe, were always on his mind, especially during trips like this. Sophia had been his rock, supporting him through the long hours and the emotional toll of his profession. She understood the sacrifices he made, just as he understood hers. Kenneth smiled as he thought about them. His girls were growing up so fast, and every time he had to leave for work or a conference, he missed them more. But this trip was important. His research on advanced heart surgery techniques was groundbreaking, and he knew that his presentation in Los Angeles could open new doors for him and for his patients. But as much as Kenneth tried to focus on the positive, there was always a lingering tension beneath the surface. Being a black man in America came with its own set of challenges, and even after all he had accomplished, he still felt the weight of prejudice. He had worked harder than most to prove himself in his field, navigating the subtle and not-so-subtle forms of discrimination that had followed him since medical school. He thought back to his early days as a medical student, the countless times he had been overlooked, underestimated, or questioned simply because of his race. He had learned to brush it off, to focus on his work. But the sting of those moments never fully disappeared. And even now, after years of success, there were still moments when he felt like he had to prove himself all over again. The sound of the boarding announcement over the intercom snapped Kenneth out of his thoughts. He glanced around the first-class cabin, noticing the other passengers, business executives, well-dressed professionals, a few families. They all seemed at ease, ready to enjoy the comfort and service that came with their expensive tickets. Kenneth settled back into his seat, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit, and took another sip of his juice. Just as he began to relax, a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see a flight attendant standing beside him, her expression cautious, her eyes scanning his seat number. She was young, probably in her early 30s, with blonde hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. Her name tag read Amy Simmons. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice polite but tinged with an edge of suspicion. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Kenneth blinked, momentarily taken aback by the question. He sat up a little straighter, unsure if he had misheard her. "Yes, this is my seat," he replied, his tone calm but firm. Amy's eyes flicked to the seat number, then back to Kenneth. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass, sir." Kenneth frowned, but he reached into his blazer pocket and handed her the pass without protest. He had learned long ago not to make a scene in situations like this. It rarely ended well. He watched as Amy scrutinized the pass, her brow furrowing slightly. After a moment, she looked back at Kenneth, her expression still skeptical. "I'll need to verify this with my supervisor," she said, before turning on her heel and walking briskly down the aisle toward the front of the plane. Kenneth exhaled slowly, shaking his head. He had been looking forward to a quiet, uneventful flight, but now the familiar tension had returned. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, watching the exchange with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. It wasn't the first time he had experienced something like this, being questioned, being doubted, but it didn't make it any easier to stomach. Moments later, Amy returned, this time accompanied by a tall man in his late 40s, wearing the uniform of the head flight attendant. His name tag read Robert Harris, and the look on his face was unmistakable, suspicion mixed with authority. He stopped in front of Kenneth's seat, folding his arms. "Sir, there seems to be some confusion about your ticket," Robert said, his tone formal but cold. "Can you please come with me?" Kenneth's stomach tightened. He glanced around the cabin again, noticing how some passengers were now openly staring at him. With a quiet sigh, he stood up, gathering his jacket and carry-on bag. He had no desire to cause a scene, but the weight of humiliation was already settling in. As Robert led him down the aisle, away from the first-class cabin, Kenneth felt the familiar sting of injustice. He had paid for his ticket, booked it months in advance, and yet here he was, being escorted away, treated as though he didn't belong. He couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the way he was being treated and the friendly, almost deferential interactions between the flight attendants and the other first-class passengers. They reached the galley near the front of the plane, and Robert turned to face him. "I'm sorry, sir, but we have no record of your first-class ticket. We're going to need to move you to coach." Kenneth's pulse quickened, and he could feel the frustration rising within him. He took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm. "There's been a mistake," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I booked and paid for this seat months ago. I have the confirmation email if you need to see it." Robert's expression didn't change. "I understand, sir, but we need to go by what's in our system. If you can't provide proof of your purchase, I'm afraid we'll have to reassign your seat." Kenneth clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to lash out. He knew that raising his voice, getting angry, would only make things worse. He had been down this road before, and it never ended well. "This is unacceptable," he said, his voice low but laced with frustration. "I demand to speak to the captain." Robert's face hardened. "Sir, if you continue to be disruptive, we'll have no choice but to remove you from the flight entirely." The threat hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. Kenneth could feel the eyes of nearby passengers on him, their gazes filled with a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and judgment. Some were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, while others pointedly looked away, pretending not to notice what was happening. With great reluctance, Kenneth gathered his belongings and followed Robert down the aisle toward the coach section. As he walked, he heard whispers behind him, felt the furtive glances from the passengers he passed. It was a humiliation he had experienced before, but that didn't make it any less painful. When he reached his new seat in coach, an elderly white woman in first class shook her head disapprovingly at the flight attendants. She didn't say anything, but her expression spoke volumes. At the same time, Kenneth caught the eye of a young black woman sitting a few rows ahead in coach. She gave him a look of understanding and sympathy, her eyes filled with quiet recognition. Kenneth settled into his new seat, the cramped space a far cry from the comfort of first class. He stared out the window as the plane began to taxi down the runway. But his mind was far from the view outside. He had faced discrimination before, but never so blatantly, never in a way that stripped him of his dignity so publicly. As the plane lifted off into the sky, Kenneth closed his eyes and leaned back, trying to focus on his upcoming presentation. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling of injustice. The exhaustion that came with constantly having to prove his worth in a world that often judged him by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. The flight had been in the air for about 20 minutes when Kenneth's frustration began to simmer, rising from an undercurrent to a near boil. He had managed to put on a calm mask when they seated him on the coach, but inside he was furious. His mind kept replaying the events over and over, the flight attendant's skeptical gaze, the authoritative tone of Robert, the judgmental glances from the other passengers. As he shifted in his cramped coach seat, Kenneth couldn't help but feel a deep sense of betrayal. He had worked so hard, sacrificed so much to reach this point in his career, and yet none of it seemed to matter. To the flight attendants, he was just another black man who didn't belong in first class. He tried to refocus his thoughts on his presentation. He had spent months preparing for this conference, perfecting his research on a new, minimally invasive technique for heart surgery. This was a game changer in his field, a procedure that could save countless lives. And yet, here he was, sitting in coach, feeling small and insignificant. As he stared out the window at the endless stretch of clouds, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir?" It was the young black woman from earlier, the one who had given him a look of sympathy. She had come over from her seat, standing in the aisle next to him. Kenneth looked up, startled. "Yes?" "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened earlier. I'm really sorry you had to go through that," she said quietly, her eyes filled with empathy. "It's not right." Kenneth felt a surge of gratitude for her words. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. "Thank you," he replied, his voice soft. It's frustrating, but I appreciate you saying that." She nodded. "I just wanted you to know that not everyone here is blind to what's going on. I've been through similar situations myself." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "It's exhausting, isn't it?" Kenneth gave a rueful smile. "Exhausting doesn't even begin to cover it." The woman smiled back, a sad but understanding expression on her face. "I just wanted to say that you're not alone, and I admire how you handled yourself back there." Kenneth nodded, his gratitude deepening. "Thank you. That means a lot." She gave him a small wave before returning to her seat. Kenneth watched her walk away, feeling a bit lighter. It wasn't much, but her kindness had pierced through the wall of frustration he had built around himself. At least someone understood what he was going through. But even with her gesture, the sting of the earlier incident lingered. As the flight attendants began serving drinks and snacks to the passengers, Kenneth noticed how easily they smiled at the other passengers in first class, how effortlessly they engaged in polite conversation. It was a stark contrast to the cold, distant way they had treated him. Kenneth took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He had dealt with this before, and he knew that letting his anger consume him wouldn't change anything. Still, the injustice gnawed at him. He couldn't help but wonder, how many times had this happened to others? How many people had been treated like this simply because they didn't fit the profile of a first-class passenger? As the plane continued its journey, Kenneth found himself lost in thought, grappling with the frustration, the anger and weariness that came from constantly fighting against a world that too often judged him by his appearance. He had risen above it before, and he would do it again, but the weight of it all was becoming harder to bear. Kenneth tried to distract himself by pulling out his laptop and going over the notes for his presentation one more time. His heart surgery research, involving innovative techniques that could reduce recovery time and surgical risks, had the potential to revolutionize cardiac care. This was his moment to shine, a culmination of years of dedication and sacrifice. He had been invited to speak at this conference, not because of his race, but because of his expertise. Yet the events on the plane reminded him that, to some, no achievement was enough to erase the color of his skin. The young black woman who had spoken to him earlier, a rare moment of understanding, still lingered in his mind. Her quiet support had been a balm for his soul, but it wasn't enough to wash away the bitterness. Why should kindness from a stranger feel like such a rare gift? Why should it feel necessary at all? Kenneth's frustration returned in full force as he noticed the ease with which the flight attendants catered to the other first-class passengers. They were being treated like VIPs, while he had been escorted to the back of the plane as though he didn't belong. He knew that even in 2024, there were still places, both literal and metaphorical, where the presence of a black man was questioned. The hum of the plane's engines did little to calm his growing frustration. He tried to take deep breaths, to remind himself that he was on his way to something greater, something bigger than this moment. But the injustice of it clung to him like an unwanted shadow. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the flight attendants began moving up and down the aisles, distributing drinks and snacks. Kenneth noticed Robert, the head flight attendant, casually chatting with a passenger in first class, laughing as though nothing had happened. His relaxed demeanor was a stark contrast to the rigid, cold professionalism he had shown when speaking to Kenneth. It was as though Kenneth's presence had been an inconvenience, an interruption in the smooth operation of the flight. Kenneth's stomach twisted with frustration. He had faced discrimination before, but there was something particularly insidious about the way it had unfolded today. He had been stripped of his dignity, not with overt words or violent actions, but with subtle doubt and suspicion, enough to make it clear that, in their eyes, he didn't belong in first class. The injustice was silent, but it spoke volumes. He glanced at the seat next to him, empty for the time being. Kenneth wished for the company of his wife, Sophia. She always knew how to ground him, how to calm his spirit when the world felt heavy. He could imagine her now, urging him to keep his head up, to focus on the bigger picture. But no matter how much he tried, the feeling of injustice sat in his chest like a lead weight. The flight attendants reached Kenneth's row, their hands moving with the practiced ease of professionals as they handed out drinks. When they reached him, however, there was a momentary pause, a hesitation so slight that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Kenneth noticed. He had learned to see the signs, the subtle cues that told him he was being viewed through the lens of race. He accepted his drink without comment, watching as they moved down the aisle without a second glance. It was as if his presence was something they wanted to forget, something that had disrupted their routine. Kenneth clenched his jaw, willing himself to stay composed. He had learned long ago that reacting with anger only played into the hands of those who doubted him. But the weight of it all, the years of having to prove himself, of fighting to be seen as more than just a black man, was beginning to take its toll. He had worked so hard to get where he was, and yet here he was, being judged by his appearance rather than his accomplishments. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his seat, staring out the window at the endless expanse of clouds. The view should have been calming, but it only reminded him of how small and powerless he felt in that moment. Despite everything he had achieved, despite the lives he had saved, and the innovations he had brought to his field, he was still being questioned, doubted, and dismissed. The murmurs of conversation around him faded into background noise as Kenneth's mind raced. He thought of his daughters, Hannah and Chloe, and wondered what kind of world they would grow up in. Would they face the same struggles he had? Would they, too, have to constantly prove their worth in a society that judged them by their race rather than their character? The thought was almost too painful to bear. He had hoped that the world was changing, that his daughters would inherit a society that was more just, more equal. But incidents like this reminded him that the road to equality was long, and the fight was far from over. Suddenly, the plane jolted slightly, and the intercom crackled to life. Kenneth's attention was drawn back to the present as the captain's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated until the sign is turned off." Kenneth reached for his seatbelt, securing it as instructed. He glanced around the cabin, watching as the other passengers did the same, their movements calm and unhurried. He tried to focus on the moment, to push away the lingering bitterness and frustration. But the emotions were too strong, too deeply ingrained to ignore. Just as Kenneth began to drift into a restless sleep, his mind still weighed down by the day's events, a commotion at the front of the plane jolted him awake. There was an unusual urgency in the voices of the flight attendants, and Kenneth could hear the faint sounds of someone calling for help. He sat up, his instincts as a doctor kicking in immediately. Something was wrong. He scanned the cabin, trying to make sense of the situation. The flight attendants were moving quickly toward the cockpit, their expressions tense and focused. Suddenly, the intercom crackled again, but this time the captain's calm voice was replaced by the panicked tone of the head flight attendant, Robert. "Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a doctor on board, please make yourself known to the cabin crew immediately." Kenneth's heart skipped a beat. He pressed the call button without hesitation, his mind already racing with possibilities. As a cardiac surgeon, he had been trained to react quickly in emergencies, and this was no exception. His personal frustration was immediately replaced by his professional duty. He stood up, catching the eye of one of the flight attendants who was rushing down the aisle. "I'm a doctor," Kenneth said calmly, his voice steady despite the growing tension around him. "What's the situation?" The flight attendant's eyes widened with relief as she recognized the gravity of the situation. "Thank God," she breathed. "It's the captain. He collapsed in the cockpit. We think he's having a heart attack." Kenneth's mind shifted into overdrive. "Take me to him," he ordered, his voice firm. The flight attendant didn't hesitate, leading him toward the cockpit with urgency. As Kenneth approached the front of the plane, he could feel the weight of the passengers' stares on him. But this time, they weren't looks of suspicion or judgment. They were looks of hope, of desperation. People were counting on him to save a life, and that responsibility now outweighed everything else. When they reached the cockpit, Kenneth was met with a chaotic scene. The co-pilot was frantically trying to maintain control of the plane while also attempting to assist the captain, who was slumped in his seat, unconscious and pale. Kenneth's eyes quickly assessed the situation. The captain's breathing was shallow and his skin was clammy. All signs pointed to a severe cardiac event. Kenneth didn't waste a second. "I need space," Kenneth ordered, stepping forward as the flight attendant scrambled to make room. "Get me the first aid kit and any medical equipment you have on board, and keep the area clear. I need silence to work." The co-pilot nodded, his face pale with worry as he kept one hand on the controls. "We've already alerted air traffic control. They're guiding us to an emergency landing." Kenneth nodded, his focus entirely on the captain. He quickly checked the man's pulse, weak and erratic. Time was of essence. Within moments, a flight attendant handed him the first aid kit, and Kenneth immediately began the necessary procedures to stabilize the captain. He applied oxygen, attached the defibrillator pads, and prepared to administer CPR if needed. His hands moved with precision and expertise, the years of training and experience guiding him through each step. The beeping of the medical equipment filled the cockpit, a constant reminder of the captain's fragile condition. Kenneth's mind was completely focused on the task at hand. There was no room for doubt, no space for hesitation. This man's life was in his hands, and he knew that every second counted. As he worked, Kenneth couldn't help but feel the irony of the situation. The same crew members who had doubted his presence in first class were now depending on him to save their captain's life. The same passengers who had watched him be escorted to coach were now watching him with hope in their eyes. The weight of that realization was heavy, but Kenneth pushed it aside. There would be time to reflect on it later. Right now, there was only one priority: saving the captain. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Kenneth administered an electric shock to the captain's heart, his hands steady as he watched the monitor for any signs of improvement. The tension in the cockpit was palpable, broken only by the soft hum of the equipment and the co-pilot's frantic updates to air traffic control. Finally, after what felt like hours, the captain's heart rate stabilized. The immediate danger had passed, but Kenneth knew the man wasn't out of the woods yet. He would need further medical attention as soon as they landed, but for now he was alive. Kenneth wiped the sweat from his brow and stepped back, letting out a slow breath. "He's stable for now," he said, his voice calm but tired. "But we need to get him to a hospital as soon as possible." The co-pilot nodded, his face a mixture of relief and gratitude. "We're preparing for an emergency landing," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, doctor. You saved his life." Kenneth gave a small nod, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. He had done his job. He had saved a life. But the emotional toll of the day's events was far from over. As the plane touched down for the emergency landing, Kenneth leaned back in his seat, exhausted but focused on the captain's condition. The aircraft rattled slightly as it came to a stop on the tarmac. Emergency vehicles were already approaching from a distance. The passengers sat in stunned silence, their relief mingling with the remnants of fear from turbulence and the emergency. Kenneth's heart still raced, but the adrenaline that had propelled him during the captain's emergency was now beginning to ebb away. His body was heavy with fatigue, not just from the effort of saving the captain's life, but from the emotional toll of the entire experience. He had been stripped of his dignity, removed from his first-class seat based on nothing more than suspicion and prejudice, only to find himself thrust into a situation where his skills were urgently needed. The shift in how people saw him was palpable. Moments before, he had been a passenger out of place in their eyes. Now he was a hero. The passengers, many of whom had watched the drama unfold with growing concern, began whispering amongst themselves, exchanging nervous glances. Some still couldn't believe what had just happened. A doctor, escorted out of first class, had just saved the life of the man flying their plane. As the flight attendants scrambled to manage the situation, Robert, the head flight attendant, approached Kenneth. His face, which had once been cold and professional, was now tight with regret. Kenneth could see discomfort in his expression, the realization that his initial treatment of Kenneth had been deeply flawed. "Dr. Parker," Robert began, his voice low, almost hesitant. I wanted to personally thank you for what you did. You saved the captain's life." Kenneth looked up at Robert, taking in the man's words. He could hear the sincerity in his tone, but the apology felt hollow after what he had experienced earlier. Kenneth wasn't a stranger to apologies. He had heard them countless times from people who had underestimated or mistreated him. But this time, the apology wasn't enough to erase the humiliation he had endured. Robert's face reddened, and he cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "And I want to apologize for how we treated you earlier. It was wrong. You had every right to be where you were, and we failed to see that. I'm deeply sorry." Kenneth stared at him for a moment, measuring his response. He had learned over the years that moments like these were complex. An apology, no matter how sincere, couldn't undo the damage that had been done. But it was a start, a small, necessary step toward acknowledgement. "Thank you," Kenneth said quietly, his voice steady. "But this isn't just about a seat on a plane. What happened earlier was about more than that." Robert's face flushed with embarrassment, and he nodded slowly. "I know," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "And I'm sorry." Kenneth sighed, leaning back in his seat. He didn't have the energy to continue the conversation. Robert's apology, while appreciated, couldn't change the fact that Kenneth had been judged and treated as though he didn't belong. The weight of the day's events hung heavy in the air, and Kenneth could feel the exhaustion settling deep into his bones. Amy Simmons, the flight attendant who had first questioned Kenneth's seat, approached him next. Her expression mirrored Robert's. Regret and guilt mingled in her features as she stood awkwardly before him. "Dr. Parker," she began, her voice soft, almost pleading, "I want to apologize as well. I shouldn't have questioned your seat like that. I didn't mean to make you feel unwelcome, and I'm truly sorry for how I treated you." Kenneth glanced at her, studying her face for a moment. Her apology, like Robert's, was sincere, but it didn't erase the hurt and humiliation he had felt earlier. He knew that Amy and Robert weren't bad people, but they had allowed their biases to cloud their judgment, and that had led to his mistreatment. "Thank you," Kenneth said again, his voice gentle but firm. "It's important that you understand that this wasn't just a mistake. It's part of a larger issue, one that affects people like me every day." Amy nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know. I promise I'll do better. I'll learn from this." Kenneth gave her a small nod, appreciating her willingness to acknowledge the issue, but knowing that the deeper work, changing the system that allowed this to happen, was still far from complete. As Robert and Amy returned to their duties, Kenneth felt a mixture of emotions swirl within him: relief that the captain had survived, frustration at the discrimination he had faced, and exhaustion from the emotional roller coaster of the day. He glanced out the window at the emergency vehicles lined up along the runway, the flashing lights casting an eerie glow across the darkened tarmac. He had done his job as a doctor, but the weight of the injustice he had endured still clung to him like a shadow. Once the captain had been stabilized and transported off the plane by emergency medical personnel, Kenneth found himself sitting alone in the terminal, waiting for the airline to arrange another flight for him and the other passengers. The adrenaline that had fueled him through the emergency was gone, leaving only the fatigue and emotional weight of the day behind. As he sat there, staring blankly at the rows of seats in front of him, passengers began to approach. One by one, they came to thank him for his actions, expressing their admiration for how he had handled the situation. Some were still clearly in awe that the same man they had watched being escorted to coach had turned out to be the one who saved the captain's life. An elderly white woman who had been seated in first class approached first. She had been one of the few passengers to shake her head disapprovingly at the way Kenneth had been treated earlier. Now, as she stood before him, her eyes were filled with a mix of gratitude and guilt. "Dr. Parker," she began, her voice trembling slightly, I wanted to thank you. What you did today, it was remarkable, and I'm ashamed to say that I didn't speak up when they treated you the way they did earlier. I should have said something." Kenneth looked up at her, offering a small, weary smile. "Thank you," he replied. "It's not always easy to speak up in situations like that, but I appreciate your words." The woman nodded, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. "I'm sorry. I'll do better next time. You deserve better." She left him with those words, and Kenneth sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on the day's events. The passengers who had once looked at him with suspicion now looked at him with respect and admiration. But the shift in their perception of him didn't erase the pain of what had happened. Soon more passengers came forward, offering their thanks and apologies. Some admitted to feeling uncomfortable with how he had been treated, while others praised him for his calm, dignified response. Kenneth listened to each of them, accepting their words with grace, but inside he felt a deep weariness. The respect and gratitude he was receiving now felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge that it had taken a life-threatening emergency for him to be seen as worthy of his seat in first class. As the passengers returned to their own seats, Kenneth noticed Linda Adams, the young black woman from Coach, making her way toward him. She had been the only one to offer him a look of understanding when he was escorted out of first class, and now as she approached, there was a quiet recognition between them. She sat down beside him, her expression thoughtful. "That was incredible what you did up there," she said softly. "Saving the captain like that." Kenneth nodded, his gaze distant. "I was just doing my job." Linda studied him for a moment, sensing the emotions he wasn't voicing. "It's more than that," she said quietly. "You handled the situation with dignity, even after what they did to you. That takes strength." Kenneth gave a small, rueful smile. "It's exhausting, though, having to prove yourself over and over again." Linda nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "Yeah, I get that. It feels like no matter how hard we work, no matter what we achieve, we still have to fight to be seen as equals." Kenneth sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It shouldn't be this way, but it is." Linda looked at him with quiet admiration. "You've done more than most people would have. You stood up, even when they tried to put you down." Her words struck a chord in Kenneth's heart. He had spent so much of his life navigating moments like this, trying to rise above the prejudice and the discrimination. But the truth was, it weighed on him. It wore him down, little by little. He thought about his daughters, about the world they were growing up in. He wanted them to live in a world where they didn't have to constantly fight for their place, where they were seen for their talents and character, not just their skin color. But days like this reminded him that the world wasn't there yet. "Thanks, Linda," Kenneth said quietly. "It helps knowing I'm not the only one who sees what's going on." Linda smiled. "You're definitely not alone." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, watching the other passengers gather their belongings and prepare for the next flight. Kenneth felt a sense of calm settle over him, a brief reprieve from the storm of emotions he had been navigating all day. As the hours passed and the terminal emptied, Kenneth found himself alone once again, his thoughts swirling. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving behind a deep sense of exhaustion, both physical and emotional. He stared out at the tarmac, the glow of the runway lights casting long shadows across the waiting planes. Despite the respect and admiration he had received after saving the captain's life, the sting of the earlier humiliation remained. It gnawed at him, a reminder that even in moments of triumph, the weight of prejudice was never far behind. The passengers and crew had praised him, but would they have seen him the same way if the emergency hadn't happened? If he hadn't proven his worth by saving a life, would they still have looked at him with the same respect? The thought lingered in his mind, heavy and unshakable. Kenneth reached for his phone and scrolled through his messages. A few of colleagues and friends who had heard about the emergency landing, some checking in to make sure he was okay. But one message stood out, A text from his mentor doctor, Philip Carter, one of the few black surgeons who had guided Kenneth early in his career. Heard about the flight. Proud of you for stepping up. But don't let them silence you with praise. You deserve more than their apologies. You deserve justice. Kenneth read the message twice, his mentor's words resonating deeply. Dr. Carter had always been a fierce advocate for standing up against injustice, and he had never been one to accept empty apologies as a resolution. Kenneth had learned so much from him, not just about surgery, but about navigating the world as a black man in a field dominated by white professionals. Kenneth's mind turned over the possibilities. The airline had apologized, and passengers had expressed their shame at how he had been treated. But was that enough? Was an apology sufficient to address the deeper issue of racial bias that had led to his mistreatment in the first place? He knew the answer in his heart. As he sat in the quiet terminal, Kenneth reflected on the countless other moments in his life where he had faced discrimination, moments that had been brushed aside with apologies and empty promises of change. But those moments had never resulted in real accountability. They had never led to meaningful change. And now here he was again, faced with the same choice: accept the apology and move on, or stand up and demand something more. Kenneth's thoughts drifted back to his daughters, to the world he wanted them to grow up in, a world where they didn't have to constantly fight to prove their worth, a world where they were seen for their abilities, their accomplishments, their humanity. He knew what he had to do. As the quiet of the terminal settled around him, Kenneth found himself replaying the events of the day in his mind. How everything, the humiliation of being escorted to coach, the tension in the air, the emergency that had turned everything on its head. He had acted out of instinct, as any doctor would, not seeking recognition or praise, but simply doing what he was trained to do: saving a life. But something about this experience felt different from the others. There had been countless moments in Kenneth's life when he had been underestimated or treated differently because of the color of his skin. Moments that he had tried to move past or ignore for the sake of his career and peace of mind. Yet the sting of those experiences never fully faded. They built up over time, accumulating like layers of weight pressing down on him. Kenneth thought of Dr. Philip Carter's message: you deserve more than their apologies. You deserve justice. The words echoed in his mind as he considered what to do next. His mentor had always pushed him to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. Dr. Carter had faced his own battles with discrimination throughout his career and had never shied away from taking action when necessary. Kenneth's phone buzzed again. It was Sophia checking in on him. He smiled as he read her text. "I'm so proud of you. You're a hero. Can't wait to hear about it all when you get home. The girls send their love." His family was his anchor, the reason he had fought so hard to build his career and overcome the obstacles in his path. Kenneth thought about his daughters, Hannah and Chloe. They were still young, but soon enough they would face the same challenges he had faced. They would encounter moments of prejudice, of people questioning their abilities and worth because of their race, and he didn't want that for them. He didn't want them to grow up in a world where they had to constantly prove themselves just to be treated as equals. As he stared out at the planes on the tarmac, the decision became clearer in his mind. Apologies weren't enough. They were never enough. If he accepted the airline's apology and moved on, nothing would change. The next time a person of color finds themselves in first class, they could face the same kind of doubt and suspicion that he had. The cycle would continue, and the deeper issues of racial bias and discrimination would go unaddressed. Kenneth knew that taking a stand wouldn't be easy. It would mean putting himself in the spotlight, something he had never sought out. It would mean fighting a battle that many people wouldn't understand or support, but it was necessary not just for himself, but for the people who came after him, for his daughters, for everyone who had been treated less than because of the color of their skin. He put his phone away and stood up, his heart heavy but resolute. He walked over to the counter where the airline's customer service representatives were speaking with passengers about the delayed flights and emergency landing. Kenneth waited patiently, his mind set on what needed to be done. When it was his turn, the airline representative, a middle-aged man with a kind but tired face, looked up. "Dr. Parker, I'm so sorry for everything that's happened today. We're working on getting everyone rebooked as soon as possible. Is there anything we can do to make you more comfortable while you wait? Kenneth took a deep breath, his voice calm but firm. I need to speak to someone from the airline's management team, he said. This isn't just about rebooking my flight. What happened today needs to be addressed properly. The representative looked surprised. His eyes widened slightly. Of course, sir. I'll get someone from management to speak with you right away. Within minutes, an airline executive arrived, his face lined with concern as he introduced himself to Kenneth. The man, Tom Davis, wore the crisp suit and polished demeanor of a corporate executive, but there was an unmistakable look of worry in his eyes. Dr. Parker, I've been briefed on the situation. First, let me apologize on behalf of the airline for the way you were treated earlier today. We deeply regret the misunderstanding and any discomfort it caused you. Kenneth nodded, listening carefully. He appreciated the man's professionalism, but he wasn't here for apologies. Thank you, Kenneth replied, keeping his tone respectful but direct. I understand mistakes happen, but this wasn't just a misunderstanding. What happened today was part of a larger issue, one that has to do with racial bias, and I'm not willing to let it slide. The executive shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting Kenneth's response. Of course, Dr. Parker, we take these matters very seriously, and we're committed to addressing any issues of bias within our organization. I assure you this incident will be thoroughly investigated. Kenneth's expression didn't change. He had heard promises like these before. I'm glad to hear that, he said evenly. But this goes beyond an internal investigation. I'm pursuing legal action against the airline for racial discrimination. This isn't just about me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. The executive's eyes widened in shock. Dr. Parker, I understand your frustration, but surely we can work this out privately. We're more than willing to compensate you for the inconvenience and ensure that this never happens again. Kenneth shook his head. This isn't about compensation. It's about accountability. I want to make sure that real change happens, not just for me, but for everyone who's been treated unfairly because of their race. Tom Davis hesitated, clearly trying to gauge how to respond. He glanced around as if searching for the right words, but Kenneth didn't waver. I'll be contacting my legal team, Kenneth said firmly. I expect to hear from yours soon. The executive's shoulders slumped slightly, his expression defeated. I see. Well, I'm sorry it's come to this, Dr. Parker, but we'll be in touch. Kenneth nodded, turning to leave. As he walked back to his seat in the terminal, he felt a sense of clarity settle over him. It wasn't the easy path, but it was the right one. Within days of the incident, news of Kenneth's decision to file a lawsuit against the airline began to spread. It started with a small article in a local paper, but soon the story was picked up by larger media outlets, and Kenneth found himself at the center of a national conversation about racial discrimination in the airline industry. The lawsuit alleged that Kenneth had been targeted and mistreated based on his race, citing the events on the plane as evidence of racial bias. His legal team, led by a renowned civil rights attorney, framed the case as part of a broader effort to challenge systemic racism in industries that often went unchecked. The airline, unsurprisingly, responded with a public statement, offering another apology and promising to review its policies. But the statement did little to quell the growing outrage over the incident. Social media exploded with debates about race, privilege, and the treatment of Black professionals in spaces where they were often made to feel unwelcome. As the days passed, Kenneth found himself juggling the demands of the lawsuit with his responsibilities as a surgeon. He continued to perform surgeries, saving lives just as he always had. But the weight of the lawsuit was never far from his mind. Every time he walked into an operating room, he was reminded of the stakes, how his skills as a surgeon had saved a life on that plane. Yet even that hadn't been enough to protect him from the racial bias he had faced. Civil rights organizations quickly rallied behind Kenneth's case, using it as an opportunity to highlight the ongoing struggle against racial discrimination in the travel industry and beyond. Hashtags like "Watch You Weren't Flying While Black" and "Watch Your First-Class Justice" trended on social media as people from all walks of life shared their own stories of discrimination while traveling. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. People who had experienced similar situations reached out to Kenneth, thanking him for taking a stand and giving a voice to those who often felt powerless. But with the support came criticism as well. News commentators debated the merits of the case, with some arguing that Kenneth was blowing the incident out of proportion. They pointed to the airline's apology and the praise Kenneth had received for saving the captain's life as evidence that the situation had been resolved. Others questioned Kenneth's motives, suggesting that he was pursuing the lawsuit for financial gain or attention. But Kenneth remained resolute. This wasn't about money or fame. It was about justice. He had spent too many years brushing off moments of discrimination, accepting apologies without real change. This time, he wasn't willing to let it go. As the lawsuit moved forward, Kenneth's legal team gathered evidence, including witness statements from passengers who had seen how he was treated on the plane. The case began to build momentum, and soon it became clear that the airline was facing more than just a public relations crisis. It was facing a legal battle that could set a precedent for how racial discrimination cases were handled in the travel industry. Kenneth kept a low profile during the early stages of the lawsuit, focusing on his work and his family. But as the media attention grew, he knew that the time would come when he would have to speak publicly. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had been made to feel small, unwelcome, or out of place because of their race. One evening after a long day of surgery, Kenneth sat down with Sophia to discuss the case. She had been his greatest source of support throughout the ordeal, and he valued her insight. "Are you sure you want to keep going with this?" Sophia asked gently, her hand resting on his. "It's a lot of pressure." Kenneth nodded. "I'm sure this isn't just about me anymore. It's about making sure this doesn't keep happening. I don't want our girls to grow up in a world where they have to deal with this kind of treatment." Sophia smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "I know, and I'm proud of you for standing up. Just don't forget to take care of yourself too, okay?" Kenneth chuckled softly. "I'll try." As the lawsuit continued to gain traction, Kenneth found himself more determined than ever. The road ahead was uncertain, and the outcome was far from guaranteed. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was fighting for something bigger than himself, something that had the power to create real change. As the lawsuit entered the public consciousness, the response from the general public became increasingly divided. On one side were those who supported Kenneth's decision to file the lawsuit, praising him for his courage in standing up to the airline and for bringing attention to the pervasive issue of racial discrimination. Civil rights organizations, activists, and many individuals on social media hailed him as a hero, someone who was willing to fight not only for himself but for others who had experienced similar injustices. But on the other side of the debate, there were those who criticized Kenneth's actions, suggesting that he was overreacting or seeking financial gain. Pundits on television debated the merits of the case, with some questioning whether a lawsuit was necessary after the airline had issued a public apology. They argued that the situation had been resolved, pointing to the airline's promises to implement diversity training and review their policies. News outlets featured heated discussions, with some commentators framing the lawsuit as a necessary stand against systemic racism, while others accused Kenneth of seeking attention or capitalizing on the incident. The divide was stark, and it highlighted the ongoing tensions in American society around race and privilege. As Kenneth watched the debates unfold on television and online, he felt a mixture of frustration and resolve. He had never sought the spotlight. His goal had always been to do his job, to help people, and to save lives. But now he was being thrust into the center of a national conversation, and the scrutiny was intense. At work, his colleagues were supportive, but Kenneth could sense the unease that came with being at the center of such a high-profile case. Some of his fellow doctors expressed their admiration for his courage, while others quietly distanced themselves, wary of the attention the lawsuit was bringing. Kenneth's mentor, Dr. Philip Carter, remained a constant source of guidance. One evening, after a particularly challenging day in the operating room, Kenneth called him for advice. "They're really coming at me," Kenneth admitted, his voice heavy with fatigue. "Some people are saying I'm doing this for the wrong reasons, that I should have just accepted the apology and moved on." Dr. Carter's voice was calm but firm. "Kenneth, you didn't go into this for praise or to please everyone. You did this because it was the right thing to do. People will always have opinions, but the truth is, most of them haven't walked in your shoes. They haven't experienced what you've experienced. Kenneth nodded, grateful for his mentor's words. It's just hard knowing that some people think I'm making a big deal out of nothing. Dr. Carter paused for a moment before replying. It's not nothing. What you're doing matters. It's about more than just you. It's about fighting for change. And change doesn't happen without resistance. Don't let the criticism get to you. You've got to keep your eyes on the bigger picture. The conversation left Kenneth feeling more grounded, but the weight of public attention was still a burden. At home, Sophia continued to offer her unwavering support, reminding Kenneth that he wasn't alone in this fight. The media storm intensified as the lawsuit moved closer to trial. News programs covered every development, with pundits and commentators offering their takes on the case. On social media, hashtags like #FlyingWhileBlack and #FirstClassJustice continued to trend, with people sharing their own stories of discrimination in travel and other areas of life. Some of the stories were heartbreaking, others infuriating, but all of them highlighted the pervasive issue of racial bias in America. Kenneth's story had struck a nerve. For many people of color, it was a reminder of the countless microaggressions, slights, and outright acts of discrimination they had faced in their own lives. For others, it was a wake-up call, an opportunity to reflect on their own biases and the ways in which racism continued to shape everyday interactions. But for some, the lawsuit was seen as an overreach, a step too far. They argued that Kenneth had been treated with respect after the emergency, that he had been praised and thanked for saving the captain's life. In their view, the issue had already been resolved, and the lawsuit was unnecessary. Kenneth knew that no matter what he did, there would always be people who didn't understand. But he also knew that the fight for justice wasn't about pleasing everyone. It was about doing what was right, even when it was hard. The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation as Dr. Kenneth Parker entered, his heart pounding in his chest. The lawsuit had drawn national attention, and the gallery was packed with reporters, civil rights activists, and spectators eager to witness what had become a high-profile case. Kenneth's attorney, Richard Matthews, stood beside him, calm and confident. Richard had a long history of winning civil rights cases, and Kenneth had put his faith in him to see this through. As Kenneth took his seat at the plaintiff's table, he glanced around the courtroom. The airline's legal team was across from him, a group of highly paid attorneys who had been hired to defend the company's reputation. They sat with straight backs and stoic expressions, their strategy clearly one of damage control. The airline's representatives were present as well, including the executives who had attempted to offer Kenneth compensation to settle the matter quietly. Kenneth had refused, knowing that this case was about much more than financial compensation. It was about accountability, not just for the airline, but for a system that allowed racial bias to persist unchecked. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s with decades of experience, entered the courtroom, and the room fell silent. She had a reputation for fairness and for no-nonsense rulings, and Kenneth hoped that she would see the truth in his case. The jury, carefully selected over the course of several days, sat to the side, their eyes watching Kenneth and the airline's representatives with careful scrutiny. Richard Matthews rose to deliver his opening statement. His voice was steady and authoritative as he outlined the case. Racial discrimination, violation of civil rights, and the systemic biases that led to Kenneth's mistreatment on the flight. He painted a clear picture of how Kenneth, a highly respected cardiac surgeon, had been targeted and humiliated based on nothing more than the color of his skin. Dr. Parker's accomplishments speak for themselves, Richard said, his voice carrying through the room. He has saved countless lives and contributed groundbreaking research to his field. And yet, despite his extraordinary qualifications, he was subjected to suspicion and prejudice simply because of his race. This lawsuit is not about money. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what Dr. Parker experienced that day. The jury listened intently, their expressions serious. Kenneth felt a surge of gratitude for Richard's eloquence. He had always been a man of few words, preferring to let his work speak for itself, but today Richard was his voice, and he was doing an excellent job. The airline's lead attorney, Susan Grant, rose next. She was a seasoned litigator, known for her ability to defend corporations in high-stakes cases. Her tone was polished, her words carefully chosen as she attempted to downplay the incident. This was an unfortunate misunderstanding, Susan began, glancing at the jury with a sympathetic expression. The airline has already issued a public apology, and our client has taken steps to ensure that this never happens again. Dr. Parker was treated with the utmost respect after the incident, and we acknowledge his heroic actions in saving the captain's life. We believe this matter has been resolved, and we hope to demonstrate that there was no malicious intent. Kenneth clenched his jaw. The attempt to brush aside his experience as a misunderstanding infuriated him, but he kept his composure. He knew that Richard would make sure the truth came to light. The trial unfolded over the course of several days, with witnesses called to the stand, including passengers who had been on the flight and flight attendants who had interacted with Kenneth. Some passengers testified about how uncomfortable they had felt when they saw Kenneth being escorted to coach, while others described their admiration for him after he saved the captain's life. But the most damning testimony came from Linda Adams, the young black woman who had offered Kenneth support during the flight. When Linda took the stand, her testimony was powerful. She described how she had watched Kenneth's interactions with the flight attendants, how she had seen the doubt and suspicion in their eyes, and how she had felt a deep sense of injustice as he was removed from first class. They didn't treat him like they treated the other passengers, Linda said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. I could see it in their faces. They didn't believe he belonged there, and that's why they questioned him. That's why they moved him to coach. The airline's attorneys attempted to discredit her testimony, suggesting that she was projecting her own experiences onto the situation, but Linda stood her ground, and her testimony left a lasting impact on the jury. When it was Kenneth's turn to take the stand, the room fell silent. He sat up straight, meeting the eyes of the jurors as he recounted the events of the flight. He spoke about his experience as a surgeon, about the pride he took in his work, and about the humiliation he had felt when he was questioned and escorted to coach, despite having paid for his seat in first class. I've spent my entire career proving myself, Kenneth said, his voice calm but resolute. I've worked harder than most to get where I am, and yet I was treated as if I didn't belong, because of my race. That's something no one should have to endure, no matter who they are or what they've accomplished. As Kenneth spoke, he could see the jurors listening intently. He knew that they couldn't fully understand what it felt like to live with the constant burden of racial prejudice, but he hoped they would see the injustice in what had happened to him. The cross-examination was tough. The airline's attorneys tried to minimize the racial element of the incident, focusing on the airline's apology and the praise Kenneth had received after saving the captain. But Kenneth's resolve never wavered. He knew what had happened, and he wasn't about to let them twist the truth. After days of testimony, cross-examinations, and closing arguments, the case was finally in the hands of the jury. Kenneth sat in the courtroom, his hands clasped tightly together as he waited for the verdict. The tension in the room was palpable. This wasn't just about winning a lawsuit. It was about making a statement, about holding the airline accountable for the way they had treated him. The jury deliberated for hours, and when they finally returned, Kenneth's heart pounded in his chest. The courtroom fell silent as the four persons stood to deliver the verdict. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Doctor. Kenneth Parker. A wave of relief washed over Kenneth. He exhaled slowly, his heart finally calming as the words sank in. He had won. The court had ruled that the airline had indeed discriminated against him based on his race. The jury's decision was clear. The airline was guilty of racial discrimination. The judge began to outline the terms of the ruling. The airline was ordered to pay substantial monetary damages to Kenneth, but more importantly, the court mandated sweeping changes within the company. The airline would be required to implement comprehensive anti-bias training for all employees, revise their customer service protocols, and establish a diversity and inclusion advisory board with the authority to influence company policies. The judge's voice echoed in the quiet courtroom as she outlined the specific measures the airline would need to take to ensure that incidents like this one didn't happen again. The ruling was a landmark decision, one that would set a precedent for similar cases in the future. Kenneth sat in silence, absorbing the weight of the moment. The lawsuit had never been about the money, it had been about accountability, about ensuring that real change happened. And now with this ruling, he had accomplished that. As the judge finished reading the verdict, Kenneth felt a sense of vindication. He had stood up for himself, for his dignity, and for others who had experienced similar treatment. And the court acknowledged the wrong that had been done to him. Richard Matthews leaned over and whispered, "We did it." Kenneth nodded, but the emotions running through him were too complex for words. Relief, exhaustion, pride. They all swirled together as he stood up, turning to face the reporters and spectators who had filled the gallery. Flashbulbs went off and reporters began shouting questions. But Kenneth wasn't focused on them. His mind was already thinking about what came next. As he left the courtroom, Kenneth was greeted by supporters, civil rights activists, colleagues, and even strangers who had followed the case. They congratulated him, thanking him for taking a stand and for pushing for change. Kenneth smiled and shook hands, but inside, he knew that the fight wasn't over. This was just one battle in a much larger war against systemic racism. The media buzzed with the news of Kenneth's victory, and headlines across the country highlighted the case as a pivotal moment in the fight for racial justice. Kenneth's story had gone viral, sparking conversations about discrimination, privilege, and the treatment of people of color in professional spaces. Social media exploded with support, and civil rights organizations praised the ruling as a step forward in holding corporations accountable for their biases. But even as the news spread, Kenneth remained focused on what mattered most, ensuring that the changes outlined in the court's ruling were implemented. He wasn't just satisfied with winning the lawsuit, he wanted to make sure that the airline followed through on its promises. In the weeks following the verdict, the airline began implementing the changes mandated by the court. Employees underwent anti-bias training, new policies were put in place to ensure that all passengers were treated with respect, and the Diversity and Inclusion Advisory Board was formed to oversee the company's progress. But the impact of Kenneth's case went far beyond the airline. Other companies in the travel industry took note, and several airlines began reviewing their own policies to ensure that similar incidents wouldn't happen to their passengers. The case had sent a clear message. Racial discrimination wouldn't be tolerated, and companies that allowed it to persist would be held accountable. Civil rights organizations used the case as a rallying point, calling for broader reforms not just in the airline industry, but in other sectors as well. They pushed for stronger protections against discrimination in housing, employment, and education, using Kenneth's case as an example of the need for systemic change. Kenneth found himself at the center of a growing movement, invited to speak at conferences and events about his experience and the importance of standing up for justice. He hadn't sought out the spotlight, but now that he was in it, he was determined to use his platform for good. He continued his work as a surgeon, saving lives just as he always had, but now he was also an advocate for change. His foundation, established in the wake of the lawsuit, focused on promoting equality and fighting discrimination in various sectors of society. It provided legal support for individuals who had experienced discrimination and funded initiatives aimed at increasing diversity in fields like medicine and law. One day, as Kenneth was leaving the hospital after a long shift, he was approached by a young black man in his early 20s. The man looked nervous but determined as he stopped Kenneth in the hallway. "Dr. Parker," the young man said, his voice filled with admiration. "I just wanted to thank you. Your story inspired me. I'm going to medical school because of you." Kenneth smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "I'm glad to hear that. Keep working hard and don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." The young man nodded, his eyes shining with determination. "I won't. And thank you again for everything you did. You're changing things." As Kenneth watched him walk away, he felt a sense of fulfillment. The lawsuit had been hard, but moments like this made it all worth it. He had taken a stand, not just for himself, but for others, and he had made a difference. Years later, Kenneth's lawsuit remained a landmark case, frequently cited in discussions about racial discrimination and corporate accountability. The airline had made significant strides in improving its policies and practices, and Kenneth's Foundation had grown into a powerful force for change, supporting initiatives that promoted diversity, equity, and inclusion in industries across the country. The case had sparked wider conversations about implicit bias and the ways in which systemic racism could be challenged and dismantled. Kenneth had become a leading voice in the fight for racial justice, using his platform to push for meaningful reforms that would create a more just and equal society. But despite his public role, Kenneth remained dedicated to his work as a surgeon. He continued to save lives, performing groundbreaking surgeries and mentoring the next generation of doctors. His career had been defined by excellence, and now it was also defined by his commitment to making the world a better place. As Kenneth reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point, he knew that the fight for equality was far from over. There would always be challenges, and there would always be those who resisted change. But he also knew that his actions had made a difference, that he had helped to move the needle toward justice, even if only a little. And as he watched his daughters grow up in a world that was slowly becoming more just and more inclusive, Kenneth felt a sense of hope. The road ahead was long, but he had helped pave the way for future generations. The ripple effect of his actions would continue to spread, touching lives in ways he couldn't even imagine. And for that, Kenneth was proud. Kenneth Parker sat in the quiet of his home office, a sense of calm washing over him as he reflected on everything that had transpired. The lawsuit had been a grueling battle, but it had also been transformative. He was no longer just Dr. Kenneth Parker, the celebrated cardiac surgeon. He had become a voice for justice, someone who had dared to stand up to discrimination in one of its most insidious forms, subtle, silent, but undeniably present. As he sat back in his chair, he allowed himself to think about the changes that had come as a result of the lawsuit. The airline industry had taken notice, and other companies beyond just airlines had started to implement their own anti-bias policies. Kenneth's case had made it clear that corporate practices of looking the other way or issuing surface-level apologies were no longer enough. There had to be real accountability, and people were finally starting to see that. But while the case had brought about significant changes, Kenneth knew the fight was far from over. The challenges of racial bias, inequality, and injustice were deeply entrenched in society, and his case was just one of many that would need to be fought in order to create lasting change. Still, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. He had taken a stand not only for himself but for others who had been silenced, and he had won. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Richard Matthews, his attorney. Just saw the news. The airline is implementing the final phase of their diversity and inclusion program. Thought you'd want to know. We did it. Kenneth smiled, typing out a quick response. Thanks for everything, Richard. It's a win for all of us. He put his phone down and turned toward the bookshelf in his office, where a framed newspaper article from the trial sat on display. The headline read, Court rules in favor of surgeon in landmark racial discrimination case. Underneath it, there was a picture of Kenneth standing outside the courthouse, surrounded by supporters. He looked calm and dignified, a man who had just faced down a corporation and won. But the memory of that day was more than just a victory. It was a turning point in his life. Kenneth's daughters, Hannah and Chloe, were now old enough to understand the importance of what their father had done. They had watched from the sidelines as he fought for justice, and now they were growing up in a world that, while still far from perfect, had been shaped in part by his actions. He often thought about the legacy he was leaving for them. Would they still have to face the same challenges he had, or would they live in a world that was more just, more fair, more inclusive? Kenneth hoped for the latter, but he knew that the work to create such a world was ongoing. He had laid the groundwork, but it would be up to future generations to continue the fight. Kenneth's life returned to a new sense of normalcy in the months following the trial, though normal had taken on a different meaning. The media attention had faded, but Kenneth's role as an advocate for social justice had only deepened. His foundation had grown, and he found himself increasingly involved in initiatives that went beyond racial discrimination in the airline industry. One day, while Kenneth was reviewing some grant proposals for the foundation, he received a call from a colleague, Dr. Elaine Foster, a leading expert in public health. Elaine had been one of his staunchest supporters during the trial, and they had kept in touch since. Kenneth, she said warmly when he answered, I have a proposition for you. Go on, Kenneth replied, leaning back in his chair. There's a conference coming up on systemic bias in healthcare, and they're looking for a keynote speaker. I thought you might be interested. Kenneth paused for a moment. The idea of speaking at a conference about bias in healthcare wasn't new to him, But after the trial, the weight of such discussions felt heavier. Still, it was an opportunity to continue the conversation, to push for change in an area where it was sorely needed. Healthcare, he repeated thoughtfully. You know, that's a topic that hits close to home. I thought it might, Elaine said with a smile in her voice. Your story and your experiences could inspire a lot of people. There's still so much work to be done, and you've got a platform now. Use it. Kenneth nodded, though Elaine couldn't see him. She was right. His voice had become more powerful since the trial, and he could use it to push for change in areas that mattered most to him. All right, he said, feeling a surge of purpose. Count me in. The conference was held in Washington, D.C., a gathering of some of the brightest minds in healthcare, social justice, and policy. Kenneth stood before a packed auditorium, the weight of responsibility resting on his shoulders. He wasn't just speaking as a surgeon or an advocate for racial justice. He was speaking as someone who had experienced firsthand the insidious nature of systemic bias. As he spoke, Kenneth shared stories from his career, moments when he had been underestimated, moments when he had seen patients of color receive substandard care because of their race. He didn't just talk about the problem, he talked about solutions, the need for diversity in healthcare, the importance of anti-bias training for medical professionals, and the necessity of policy changes to ensure that every patient, regardless of their background, received the care they deserved. By the time he finished, the room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then slowly, the audience rose to their feet in applause. Kenneth felt a surge of emotion as he stepped down from the stage. The fight for justice was never easy, but moments like this reminded him why it was so important. After the conference, Kenneth was approached by a group of medical students who had been in the audience. They were young, passionate, and eager to make a difference. "You're the reason I'm here," one of the students said, her voice filled with admiration. "I saw what you did, how you stood up against the airline, and I knew I had to be part of this fight." Kenneth smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "You're the future," he said. "Keep fighting. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." The students nodded, their determination clear. Kenneth watched them leave, knowing that the torch was being passed to the next generation. As the years passed, Kenneth's work continued to evolve. His foundation grew into a national organization, supporting initiatives that addressed not only racial discrimination, but also healthcare inequality, education access, and economic justice. Kenneth's role as a surgeon remained central to his identity, but his legacy was now intertwined with his advocacy work. Hannah and Chloe had grown into strong, confident young women, both of them inspired by their father's courage and dedication. Kenneth often marveled at how they had blossomed, how they had taken the lessons he had tried to teach them and made them their own. One day as they sat together on the back porch of their home, Kenneth and Sophia watched their daughters laugh and talk about their future plans. Hannah was preparing for college, eager to study law and continue the fight for justice in her own way. Chloe, still in high school, had developed a passion for healthcare and was considering following in her father's footsteps. Sophia leaned over and squeezed Kenneth's hand. "You did good," she said quietly, her eyes filled with pride. Kenneth smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. "We did good," he corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Sophia smiled back. "You've always been strong, Kenneth, even when the world tried to tell you otherwise." Kenneth looked out at his daughters, watching them as they dreamed of a future that was brighter, more just, more inclusive. He knew that the world was still far from perfect, but he also knew that his actions had helped move it in the right direction. As the sun set over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the backyard, Kenneth reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The challenges, the victories, the setbacks, they had all shaped him into the man he was today. He had stood up to injustice, fought for what was right, and made a difference. But perhaps his greatest legacy was not in the courtroom or the operating room. It was here, with his family, with the people he loved most, and with the knowledge that he had helped create a world where his daughters and future generations could live with dignity and equality. Kenneth's case had been a landmark victory, but he knew that the fight for justice would never truly end. There would always be more battles to fight, more systems to challenge, more voices to uplift, and Kenneth was ready to continue the work. knowing that progress was built on the persistence of those who refused to give up. In the years following the trial, Kenneth continued to advocate for systemic change. He worked closely with lawmakers, pushing for legislation that would address racial bias in the healthcare system and beyond. He served on boards for civil rights organizations, lending his expertise and passion to the ongoing fight for equality. But he also found time to enjoy the quieter moments of life: family dinners, weekend hikes, evenings spent with Sophia on their porch, watching the world go by. His life was full, and while the scars of discrimination would always be there, they were no longer a source of pain. They were a reminder of his strength, of the battles he had fought and won, of the lives he had changed. One afternoon, as Kenneth sat in his office reviewing a new proposal for the foundation, he received a letter in the mail. It was from a young man named Marcus Johnson, a medical student at the same university where Kenneth had once studied. The letter was simple, but its words carried profound meaning. Dr. Parker, your story inspired me to pursue a career in medicine. I want to be the kind of doctor who not only saves lives, but fights for justice, just like you did. Thank you for showing me what's possible. Kenneth smiled as he read the letter, feeling a deep sense of pride. The fight for justice wasn't over, but it was in good hands. The next generation was ready to take up the mantle, to continue the work that he and others had started. As Kenneth folded the letter and placed it on his desk, he looked out the window, the sun shining brightly outside. The world was still full of challenges, but it was also full of hope. And that was enough. Kenneth Parker's life had settled into a rhythm, a balance between his career as a cardiac surgeon and his growing role as an advocate for social justice. However, as the years passed, Kenneth began to see new opportunities to expand his mission beyond the courtroom and the hospital. His foundation had grown exponentially, its reach extending across the country, funding initiatives that focused on fighting systemic discrimination in healthcare, education, housing, and employment. But Kenneth wasn't satisfied yet. He knew there was more to be done, and he was eager to be at the forefront of the next wave of change. One day, Kenneth sat in his office at the foundation, surrounded by reports from recent projects and proposals for future initiatives. His longtime friend and collaborator, Elaine Foster, walked in, holding a stack of papers. "We've got a new opportunity," she said, a spark of excitement in her eyes. "The city of Atlanta is launching a major health equity initiative, and they're looking for someone to lead the charge. They want to address racial disparities in healthcare access across the state, and your name was the first one that came up." Kenneth looked up from his desk, intrigued. "Health equity? That's right in our wheelhouse. What's the plan?" Elaine set the papers down in front of him. "The city wants to create a comprehensive strategy to reduce health disparities in marginalized communities. Better access to preventive care, community health programs, mental health resources, the whole package. They're putting together a task force, and they want you to be at the helm." Kenneth scanned the documents, his mind racing with the possibilities. He had spent years advocating healthcare equity on a national level, but this was a chance to make an impact on a more localized scale, to see the tangible results of the changes he had been fighting for. "This is big," he said, leaning back in his chair, "but it's also a lot of responsibility." Elaine smiled knowingly. "You've been handling responsibility your entire life, Kenneth. This is exactly the kind of project that can build on the work you've already done. You've fought in the courtroom, you've changed corporate policies, and now you can reshape an entire city's approach to healthcare." Kenneth nodded slowly, his excitement growing. "All right, I'm in. Let's do it." Over the next few months, Kenneth threw himself into the new project with renewed energy. He worked closely with city officials, healthcare providers, and community leaders to craft a strategy that would address the root causes of health disparities in Atlanta's most vulnerable neighborhoods. He pushed for increased funding for clinics in underserved areas, advocated for culturally competent care, and worked to dismantle the systemic barriers that had long kept marginalized communities from receiving adequate health care. The work was challenging, but Kenneth thrived on the sense of purpose it gave him. He traveled throughout the city, meeting with doctors, patients, and community leaders, listening to their stories and using their input to shape the initiative. It wasn't just about policy, it was about people, and Kenneth was determined to make sure their voices were heard. As the Health Equity Initiative gained momentum, Kenneth found himself taking on another important role: mentorship. Young doctors and medical students, many of them from marginalized backgrounds, began reaching out to him for guidance and support. Kenneth had always made time for mentoring, but now it has become a central part of his life. One day while sitting in his office reviewing reports from the initiative, Kenneth received a call from Marcus Johnson, the young medical student who had written him that heartfelt letter years earlier. "Dr. Parker," Marcus said, his voice filled with excitement, "I'm graduating from med school next month, and I'm heading into my residency in cardiac surgery. I wanted to thank you again for everything. You've been such an inspiration to me." Kenneth smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's fantastic, Marcus. I'm proud of you. You're going to do great things." Marcus hesitated for a moment. "I was wondering, would you have time to grab coffee sometime? I'd love to get your advice on how to navigate the next steps. I know there's still a lot I need to learn, especially as a young black man entering this field." Kenneth didn't hesitate. "Of course, I'd be happy to meet with you. Let's set something up for next week." When they met for coffee, Kenneth was struck by Marcus's determination and passion. He saw so much of himself in the young doctor, someone who was eager to make a difference but aware of the challenges that lay ahead. Over the course of their conversation, Kenneth shared stories from his own career, offering advice on how to handle the pressures of the medical field, how to deal with prejudice, and how to stay true to his values in the face of adversity. "Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong," Kenneth said firmly. "You've earned your place here, and you have every right to take up space. Keep pushing forward even when the system tries to push back." Marcus nodded, absorbing every word. "Thank you, Dr. Parker. I'll do my best." As Kenneth watched Marcus leave the cafe, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Mentoring young doctors like Marcus wasn't just about passing on medical knowledge. It was about helping them navigate the complexities of a world that wasn't always welcoming. Kenneth had fought those battles himself, and now he was determined to help others avoid some of the same struggles. Over the next few years, Kenneth mentored dozens of young doctors, helping them find their footing in a field that was often hostile to people of color. His legacy was no longer just about his own achievements. It was about the doors he was helping to open to others. Back at home, Kenneth's daughters, Hannah and Chloe, had grown into strong, independent women. Hannah was now in her second year of law school, determined to follow in her father's footsteps as an advocate for justice. Chloe, who had decided to pursue a career in medicine, had just started her undergraduate studies with the goal of becoming a pediatrician. One evening, as Kenneth sat with Sophia at the dinner table, he couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come as a family. The struggles and triumphs of the past had shaped them all, and now Kenneth could see the fruits of his labor in the lives of his children. "I can't believe how fast they're growing up," Sophia said, her voice filled with pride. "It feels like just yesterday they were running around the house with their toys, and now look at them. Hannah's practically a lawyer, and Chloe's on her way to becoming a doctor." Kenneth smiled, a sense of contentment settling over him. "We did something right, didn't we?" Sophia laughed softly. "I'd say so." Kenneth had always tried to instill in his daughters the values that had guided him throughout his life: hard work, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what was right. He had made mistakes along the way, but looking at his family now, he felt a deep sense of pride in the legacy he was leaving behind. A few weeks later, Hannah came home for a visit from law school, bringing with her a stack of books and notes from her latest assignments. She sat down with Kenneth, eager to discuss the cases she had been studying. "I've been thinking a lot about civil rights law," Hannah said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "I want to focus on cases that involve healthcare discrimination, just like what you dealt with during your trial. There's still so much work to be done." Kenneth's heart swelled with pride as he listened to his daughter's passion. "You're going to be an incredible lawyer, Hannah. And you're right, there's a lot of work ahead, but I know you're up to the task." Hannah smiled. "I learned from the best." As the years passed, Kenneth watched with pride as his daughters carved out their own paths in the world. Hannah became a civil rights attorney, fighting for justice in the courtroom, while Chloe went on to medical school, determined to make a difference in pediatric healthcare. They had taken the lessons their father had taught them and applied them to their own lives, continuing the work of fighting for equality and justice in their own unique ways. In the final years of his career, Kenneth took a step back from surgery, focusing more on his advocacy work and his role as a mentor. His foundation continued to thrive, and he remained a leading voice in the fight for racial equity in healthcare. But as much as he loved the work, Kenneth also found joy in the quieter moments of life, spending time with his family, traveling with Sophia, and watching his daughters succeed in their careers. One day, while sitting on the porch of their home, Kenneth and Sophia reflected on the journey they had shared. "You've accomplished so much," Sophia said, her voice filled with admiration. "You've changed the world in ways most people can only dream of." Kenneth smiled, his heart full. "We've accomplished it together," he corrected gently. "None of this would have been possible without you." Sophia squeezed his hand. "You've always been my hero, Kenneth, and I know our daughters think the same." Kenneth looked out at the horizon, the sun setting in the distance. The fight for justice was far from over, but he had played his part. He had stood up for what was right, even when it was difficult. He had fought for change, and in doing so, he had left a legacy that would endure long after he was gone. As the evening settled in, Kenneth felt a deep sense of peace. The world wasn't perfect, but it was better than it had been, and he had helped make it that way. And for that, he was grateful. Years later, Kenneth Parker's name became synonymous with the fight for justice and equality. His landmark lawsuit continued to be studied in law schools across the country, and his work in healthcare equity became a model for other cities and states looking to address racial disparities. But Kenneth's greatest legacy was the people he had inspired, the young doctors, lawyers, and advocates who had followed in his footsteps, determined to continue the fight for justice. His foundation, now a national organization, continued to fund initiatives that promoted racial equity in healthcare, education, and beyond. Hannah, now a renowned civil rights attorney, carried on her father's work, fighting for justice in the courtroom and advocating for systemic change. Chloe, a respected pediatrician, worked tirelessly to ensure that every child, regardless of their background, received the care they deserved. Kenneth's story had become a symbol of what was possible when one person stood up against injustice. His courage, determination, and unwavering commitment to doing what was right had created ripples that would continue to spread for generations to come. As his daughters carried on his legacy, Kenneth knew that the fight for justice was in good hands. He had done his part, and now it was their turn. And so, the story of Dr. Kenneth Parker, surgeon, advocate, and champion of justice, came to a close, but his legacy lived on in the lives he had touched, the systems he had helped change, and the world he had made just a little bit better. Thank you for watching. To stay updated on more stories that inspire, inform, and challenge, be sure to hit the subscribe button below.